coach, a webinar is an amazing tool that I feel like every coach should use. Some people call it master classes, some people call it trainings, whatever you call it. The thing is, you need some sort of lead magnet that's going to allow people to understand who you are, what you have to offer, and see you as the expert that you truly are. Now, before you get defeated and throw in that proverbial towel and say, okay, I've done a webinar and it didn't go the way I wanted, or I've been to a webinar and it wasn't really that exciting, I have 3 hacks that I'm going to share that you need to know before your next webinar so that you can make sure it's successful, impactful, and actually fun. The first tip when holding a webinar is to tell a story, but make sure your story relates to the topic at hand. The story can be about yourself, the story can be about a client, the story can be about a movie that relates to it. The point is, you want to tell stories that really engage and excite people, that draw them in. And when you tell stories, it's a great way to attract your audience because it feels relatable, it feels real, and it's almost like reading a book or watching a movie. So it's really enticing as well. So consider a story that's related to your overall topic and practice telling it. Tell it to your kids, tell it to your spouse, tell it to your friends. Share a little bit about it online and see if other people are engaged with it. And then determine how you can weave that into your upcoming webinar. One of my very first webinars that I ever ran was about how to write a book. And I talked about the story of J.K. Rowling, how she had launched her book and shared it with 12 different publishing houses, and none of them wanted to take her book. And now Harry Potter is known as the second most read book next to the Bible. I shared that story because there were a lot of people who joined my webinar that felt really defeated. Maybe they had tried and they weren't able to be successful with following through. Maybe they shared their idea and people didn't understand it. But I wanted them to know that just because other people don't see your vision, that's not an excuse to give up on yours. So that story was very relatable and it helped to encourage them as well. The second tip is to engage your audience. The most boring webinars that are out are the ones where the people just talk at you. They're not engaging with you. They're not asking you questions. They're not asking for feedback. It just feels like they're just trying to talk at you and then go about their way. So one of the things that I like to always advise is to find creative ways to engage your audience. Typically for me, in the beginning, I'll say, type in the chat box if you can hear me. Type in the chat box what you ate for dinner last night. Type in the chat box where you're located. And the reason that I do that is because I want to engage them. I also like to include slides that have questions on them as well. That way, when the audience is writing in the chat box, I can engage and talk about their questions. And so they feel really heard and held throughout the webinar. And it doesn't feel like I'm just there to check a box or just there to talk at them, but they feel very much so included. So when you consider your next webinar or your first webinar, consider how you can create opportunities to engage with your audience as well. Finally, the third and final strategy that I think is so important and super imperative for everyone to include in a webinar is a call to action. Now, a lot of times people get worried if they're going to sell something at the end of the webinar that people will drop off. And that's true. People do typically drop off toward the end of the hour or however long your webinar is. But a great way to keep your audience until the end is to either open up for Q&A at the end. So now they're getting kind of free coaching or free information because they get to ask their questions, or offer a freebie at the end of the webinar as well. In doing this, you inspire your audience to hang tight until the end because it behooves them and serves them if they wait until the end, whether they get a freebie or whether they get to just have that open space to connect with you and answer questions or ask questions. So for me, one of the things that I do when I'm creating a webinar is I actually use both. I say that I'll open up for Q&A at the end, so make sure that you hang tight because I want to be able to dive in and answer your questions. And I also say I will offer a free bonus for anyone who's a live viewer that hangs with me the entire time because I have tons of goodies and values to give. What this does is it inspires them to hold on until the end. It also keeps them engaged throughout the webinar. So even at the end of the webinar or in the middle or in the beginning, if I'm talking about a potential pitch or a next step, I don't worry about people leaving because I know that what I have to offer them at the end, one, including the pitch, is valuable, but two, opening up for Q&A or a freebie is also going to benefit them as well. While webinars have once felt extremely overwhelming, they don't have to feel that way anymore. The hacks and tricks that I shared with you today are what some of the most world-renowned and top presenters use to not only engage and entice their audience, but to make sure that they really have their attention from the beginning to the end. So I challenge you to consider the way in which you can build these things in to your webinar so that it, in the long run, can be as successful as you desire and deserve.